When it comes to best ball, there is so much that the data can tell us about what's worked previously. When it comes to Draftkings, they don't release their data in the same way that other companies do, so it's a lot harder to work out what's worked previously. But I've got 2 years of best ball finalist data from some of their biggest competitions. Using this, I can help you learn what the teams that got to the finals look like and what kind of strategies they used to get there. We can take this and then work out how we can apply it in 2024 if we want to win big playing Draftkings Best Ball. In 2023, there were 1,364 different teams that made the Draftkings Millie Maker final. That's a lot of different teams with a lot of different strategies. A lot of the data we're going to look at, it's influenced by the massive spike weeks from players in week 15 and week 16. For instance, Amari Cooper was on 54% of the finalist teams, but it ended up counting for nothing once he missed week 17 through injury. There were 573 different players across the 1,364 different rosters, but there were only 6 who were at 30% or higher. So it's important to remember this data, it does have holes in it. It's not a foolproof system, but there's next to zero data out there about Draftkings Best Ball, and I believe that some insights about how to attack it are better than none at all. Using ADP from when the contest closed, we can pair up all the finalists' rosters from the finals and work back and decode the strategies. Let's start by looking at the winning teams from 2021 all the way through to 2023. In 2021, Felix Castro, shout out Felix, won $1 million with his team. It was a 3 QB, 5 RB, 10 wide receiver, 2 tight end build. He hit on so many breakouts in Amon-Ra St. Brown, Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase. His team had 3 quarterbacks, all stacked with at least one teammate. He also looked into a slightly bigger Lions stack when Josh Reynolds left the Titans and joined the Lions. Importantly for Felix, this team also had 5 players playing in the Week 17 game between the Bucs and the Jets. In 2022, Irby 494 ran pure with a 4-6-7-3 team that featured Jacoby Brissett, who played only 8 games, and Jordan Love, who had 21 pass attempts across the entire season. This team had one very small stack with Russell Wilson and Jerry Jeudy, and then some non-QB correlation with the Eagles. The Eagles went on to put up 10 points in Week 17, but this team still had enough to win. Irby obviously paid a little attention to correlation when drafting this team because he had some correlation between Kansas City and Denver, but also would have had more with CMC and Mike Evans if CMC hadn't been traded to the Niners mid-season. Ultimately, though, it didn't matter. And this team, it had the players who mattered and won $1 million. In 2023, Alex 1939 won with a 3-6-8-3 build. 3 small stacks, Dak and CD, Nico and Stroud. And then at the time of drafting, a bit more out there, but Stafford with Cam Akers and Kyron Williams. Quarterback running back stacks is something we're going to come back to later, but they're definitely something that we're seeing become more prevalent and more useful in best ball. This is a really well-built team. It's got teammate correlations of Jerome Ford and Amari Cooper, who crushed down the stretch, Jonathan Taylor and Alec Pierce, Sam Laporta and Jameson Williams. It had Week 17 correlation between the Cowboys and the Lions with 4 players in that game alone. It also had a bringback of a Giants player on the Rams. Even if it didn't work out, there was a lot of thought that went into drafting this team. We don't know when this team was drafted, so it's hard to say exactly when the picks were made in ADP, but if they drafted in August, then they likely got Jonathan Taylor at around pick 33, then Aaron Jones at around pick 70, and Cam Akers around that area as well. It was something a lot of drafters were avoiding. You know, you didn't want to be taking a lot of running backs in that kind of dead zone area. So 3 years, 3 different builds. For anyone who believes there's one single way to win in best ball, this should be your first takeaway from this video. There's a lot of different ways that we can attack things on DraftKings, probably more so than on Underdog where we've only got 18 picks. If you want more best ball content, this is the channel for you. Hit the subscribe button down below. We do Underdog drafts on Mondays, sometimes on Fridays and Sundays. DraftKings drafts every single Wednesday. Loads of best ball strategy videos. We've got everything you need here to crush your best ball drafts in 2024. So we looked at the winners, but how do the rest of the teams that made the final go about making their builds? Let's start with pick allocation on a raw numbers basis. At quarterback specifically, we can see that teams had between 1 and 5 quarterbacks. 3 QB was by far the most popular. At running back, 6 RB builds dominated, making up over 54% of the teams in the finals. And it makes sense because you can only start 2 plus a flex every week. So that's a max of 3. Whereas at wide receiver, you can start 3 plus a flex as well. So up to 4 each week. So we're always going to see running backs slightly less than wide receivers. 6% of the total teams had 10 wide receivers on them, with 6.9% in total having 10 or more. So while we want plenty of wide receivers, we definitely don't need to go into double figures too often. At tight end, we can see that 3 tight end builds dominated, in part because the elite tight ends normally used in 2 tight end builds. They all had a poor year. Travis Kelce was well below average. Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson got injured. George Kittle was very up and down. And Kyle Pitts, of course, was still dealing with a case of Arthur Smith. We know the winner used a 3-6-8-3 build, and that's a build that's extremely popular on DraftKings. It was the most popular type in 2022, making up 17% of the finalists that year. And then in 2023, we saw it grow to almost 24%. The next nearest was a 2-6-9-3 build. Despite the fact that a lot of quarterbacks got injured, there was still some value in going with 2 QB builds. 2022 also had a lot of quarterbacks being injured, but we still saw an increase by 2.5% in how popular they were, making up 12% of the total finals teams. The first kind of more weird build or out there was a 4-6-7-3 build, which was present on only 2 teams in the 2022 final, but 96 in 2023. That is an absolute massive increase, and it's probably in part down to those quarterback injuries. 2023 was the second year in a row where we saw 60 plus different starters at quarterback position start games. So it makes sense that maybe people who were getting burned in 2022 by QB injuries, they decided to push the boat a little further and go with 4 QB builds in 2023. There were 6 different builds that appeared on at least 5% of teams in the finals. This was more concentrated in 2022 when 8 different builds made up 5% or more. One team with a single QB made it to the finals using a 1-5-10-4 build. There's been plenty of arguments about this on Twitter about whether it's a viable strategy. For me, it's not a winner. You're relying on having plenty of chalk to carry you to the final at the running back, wide receiver positions, and the tight end. But then you're also hoping that just what those few players are going to help you differentiate to get up the leaderboard. And having one quarterback, to me, it just reduces your chance of landing on a nuclear stack that just explodes and carries you all the way. So to recap positional allocations, at quarterback, 3 quarterbacks has dominated for 2 years straight. But let's remember, we've seen over 150 different quarterbacks in that time start games. And that might not continue. We could see that trend start to regress. So don't be afraid to still throw in some 2 QB builds. At running back, anything outside of 5 to 7 running backs, it just didn't do well. 6 running backs dominated though for the second straight year. At wide receiver, we can see that for the second straight year, it was 8 wide receivers what was most optimal. So the best teams had between 7 to 9 wide receivers. And at tight end, 3 tight end builds continue to be a really strong play, even if you're using one of those early tight ends. A lot gets made about 0 RB, hero RB, so many other micro strategies. So which ones thrived in 2023? We know on Underdog, 0 RB absolutely hit it out of the park, won people millions of dollars over there. But the winning team here on DraftKings likely took 2, possibly 3 running backs in the first 70 or so picks. So let's start there with the running backs. Hero RB dropped from representing 18% of teams in 2022 down 9% in 2023. Probably because outside of Christian McCaffrey, there weren't that many success stories in the first 2 rounds of drafts last year. 0 running back also dropped though, in a year where it was widely successful on a number of platforms. It dropped from 8.8% in 2022 down to 5.7%. Thanks to Blair Andrews of Rotoviz, though, we know these numbers weren't too dissimilar to what was going on Underdog. 0 running back was at 6.3% there, and hero running back was at 11.5%. The DraftKings final, it was bigger than the final on Underdog, and we know it's a more casual platform, attracting a more casual audience, so it makes sense that these numbers are lower, because there's less sickos who are building these more extreme teams that we define within this structure. The ever controversial Robust RB dropped from 8.8% in 2022 down to 5.79%. And dual running back dropped from 15.7%, quite a successful number in 2022, down at 8%. So if all these numbers are dropping, what ways were the teams who were here building? Last year when I ran these numbers, I only checked these 4 definitions and I referred to everything else as undefined. That was 50% of the teams that year in a 969 team final. This year, that would have come in at 72% of teams who were building without what we'd refer to as a defined structure. That's massive, and it left so much ambiguity that I was like, I've got to get into these numbers more, find out what it is that these teams are doing. So I opened up the definitions, threw in a lot more, and decided that there was a lot more we could learn from it. Hyperfragile refers to having 3 running backs in the first 72 picks and then no more than 5 in total. This type of build, it was really successful in the early days of Best Ball on Underdog. Justin Herzig won Best Ball Mania there, but we'd reduce it down to 4 running backs in total for Underdog because you've only got those 18 roster spots, whereas here on DraftKings, you've got to expand it up to 5 total running backs. 8.2% of teams had this kind of build in the DraftKings final in 2023, so it was more successful in getting numbers to the final than 0 running back, robust running back, dual running back. This is probably in part because DraftKings people feel more comfortable taking running backs earlier, so it's an easier build to fall into. I also wanted to see how many teams double dipped into the supposed running back dead zone. That's where our winner likely got 2 running backs from. For anyone not familiar with running back dead zone, it's typically defined as rounds 3 to 6. It's an area where historically running backs haven't done great. If you want to find out more about the area of drafts, which is amazing for Best Ball, check out this video where I talk about my favorite targets, an area that's been historically rich, and it'll set you up for success well in 2024. 8.2% of teams hit the double dead zone dip and made it to the finals. This is in a large part because 2 of the top 3 running backs on finals teams, Jahmyr Gibbs and Breece Hall, they both had dead zone ADPs. If we had pick-by-pick data to know exactly where players were taken, then this might also include James Cook and Rachaad White, who would have landed in here too. Their ADPs were just outside the dead zone, so it's not unreasonable to think that a lot of people took them in that range as well. So is the dead zone dead? Maybe, maybe not. It's still quite ambiguous. There were 14 dead zone running backs last year, and outside of Breece Hall and Jahmyr Gibbs, no other running backs were on the finals roster at a higher level than 8%. So it really was Jahmyr Gibbs and Breece Hall who were the exception to the rule last year. But this should be a reminder. If you believe in a player's talent in these rounds, then we've seen taking chances on them can pay off on DraftKings. At wide receiver last year, I talked extensively about how important it was to have 5 wide receivers before you got to round 10. If you watched any of my Best Ball streams or any of my content last year, you'll have heard me talk about it. And guess what? It smashed. It went from being on 48% of rosters in 2022 to 61% in 2023. This year, it's a little bit harder to achieve that because wide receivers have been pushed up the board so much, but I still want 5 wherever possible, and I want at least 4 through 7 rounds. That's something that Hayden Winks of Underdog Fantasy has talked about and written about extensively. Interestingly, a hero wide receiver, or just 1 wide receiver through 4 rounds, did really well last year. It was at 13% of the finalist teams. That's 4% more than hero running back and 8% more than 0 RB. Looking at the combination of strategies applied on these teams, we can see these teams typically were built with a dual running back start, then tried to get to 5 wide receivers before round 10. So likely took an elite quarterback or elite tight end along with those 2 running backs that they started out. And then they started to hammer wide receiver. That should be your main takeaway here. You can build different early on, but you're still going to have to hammer the wide receiver position to get yourself back on an even playing field with everyone else in your room. At quarterback, 2 QB in a window is a rotoviz tactic that refers to double dipping at QB between round 7 and 12 range. That showed out really well. Punt quarterback, which involves waiting till pick 150 before selecting your first quarterback, did not. Despite the fact that CJ Stroud, Jared Goff, Brock Purdy all smashed from that area of the draft. Also, waiting until round 10 and then taking 4 quarterbacks was another tactic that didn't work out. You needed to be balanced with your approach to the quarterback position. At tight end, not a single bully tight end team made the finals last year. This is when you double dip on the elite tight ends. And it makes sense because of what we've talked about already. The elite tight ends had a bad year in 2023. Punt tight end, that refers to 3 after pick 168. This was a good tactic in part because Trey McBride and Jake Ferguson both smashed from this range of the draft. Here we can see the most typical pairings for all of the strategies. Some are obvious, like elite quarterback pairing well with a late quarterback. If you're taking an elite quarterback, the last thing you want to do is then take another elite quarterback very quickly. So that one makes sense. Robust RB teams, they paired well with the late quarterback tactic as well. Again, because if you're doing this build and spending a lot of draft capital on running backs early, then you can't afford to be using your next few picks on quarterbacks. You've got to be hammering that wide receiver room and trying to get to 4 wide receivers through round 7 or 5 wide receivers by round 10, something that almost 30% of these teams still managed to hit. And here are running back teams that made the final. They also had wide receiver 5 by round 10, 80% of the time. It's a really easy pairing to make happen, and it can really build out a really strong roster on DraftKings. Some of these builds, though, they were undoubtedly influenced by the high advance rate players. 11 players were present on 20% or more of the finalist teams. Amari Cooper at 54%, Amon-Ra St. Brown at 40%, Jared Goff 33%, CeeDee Lamb 32%, CMC 32%, Sam Laporta 30%, Jahmyr Gibbs 26%, David Njoku 24%, Breece Hall 24%, James Cook 23%, and Mike Evans just creeping in at 20%. For the teams that used hero wide receiver, a strategy that you're not seeing anybody go, this is the way you need to win, 52% of them featured 2 of the 6 players drafted in the areas that fit that structure. So it was really about hitting that right combination as well as moving away from wide receiver early. Hero running back teams featured CMC on 62.9% of the 124 teams. Robust RB teams featured 2 of those 4 running backs on 30 of the 72 teams that made up the finals. There's always an element of picking the best players, but we have to be mindful of the strategy that we're using to get those players. Like, you want the right player profiles for the right roster construction. Adding Breece Hall last year to a robust RB build allowed you to get 2 round 1 caliber running backs, despite the fact that Breece Hall wasn't going in round 1. He only wasn't going in round 1 because of his knee injury, but we knew there was a chance he was going to come back and be okay. So if you can find a player that you're convinced is mispriced and that they have the profile that belongs substantially higher, then it makes sense to do these different builds. Get weird with them, because that player, the moment you draft them, you're already saying that they're going to give you leverage on the field. So experiment with it, try different things out, and you could end up striking it massive. We know that stacking is a big deal these days. Mike Leone found in his Best Ball manifesto that 11 out of 12 teams in every underdog draft are stacking in some form or another. But what about here on DraftKings? We're definitely seeing more teams stack on DraftKings now. In 2022, there was 5.47% of teams that had 0 QB plus teammate stacks. In 2023, that number fell down to 2.86%. That's a tiny fraction of this 1,364 teams that had no stacks whatsoever. We also saw the number of teams that only had 1 stack drop by 4%. So it's fair to say that the field is catching up on DraftKings and stacking is going to keep becoming more commonplace. There were less teams with 2 stacks on their roster, but there were more with 3 and 4. Looking at the most common stacks, QB plus 1 wide receiver was massively dominant, sitting at 806 instances across the entire 1,364 rosters. That was way more than double the next nearest common combination. That next nearest combination was QB plus 1 wide receiver plus 1 tight end, something that occurred 343 times. Interestingly, though, the next 2 most common iterations were both quarterback plus running back stacks. We're starting to see much more quarterback and running back stacks creep into best ball, and it's something I would absolutely not worry about taking this year. If I've got a chance to bet on an offense, I'm going to bet on the offense if I believe in it, whether it's a quarterback and a running back or quarterback and a wide receiver, quarterback and a tight end. Quarterback plus 2 wide receivers was way behind at 245 instances. That's fewer than it was in 2022 when there were only 267 instances, but that was a smaller final with only 969 teams. This could be in part due to a lot of stud wide receivers getting injured last year. You know, guys like Justin Jefferson. We also saw Jamar Chase dealing with subpar quarterback play at times. But it could just be reflective of the idea that smaller stacks can be more efficient and give you a chance to get access to more offenses across the rest of your team. A monster stack could absolutely help you dominate in the final if you hit the nuts outcome of a game that just goes nuclear. But getting there with a massive stack, it seems to be so much more difficult than people like to think it is. So your takeaways for 2024 should be that 3-6-8-3 remains king. That's 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 8 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. It's been a dominant structure here on DraftKings, and using the extra rounds we have, it affords us to be able to do that. That opens up the next point, that 3 QB and 3 tight end builds, they still remain viable even if you're taking elite options at the top end of the draft, because we've got those 2 extra rounds later on that we don't have on Underdog, and we can use those to just give ourselves that little bit more balance, that little more leeway. Our quarterbacks don't have to be quite as perfect. 3-6-8-3, it's going to be very popular again this year. Small stacks continue to be great. I love stacking. I've been a big proponent of stacking for a long time, but at a certain point you have to listen to the data and go, it's possible I'm just overstacking too much. Much as I, sitting here with these Raven shirts behind me, want to leave drafts with Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman on every roster, it just seems like all the data is saying you don't need to go quite that far. And even me as a 0 RB bro, somebody who loves to draft wide receiver heavy early on, when you look at DraftKings and you see these winning rosters, it's pretty obvious that taking running backs early isn't a bad strategy. And in a year where they're being devalued, there could easily be some running backs that we might be ignoring in those first 6-7 rounds that could absolutely go crazy. And that feeds into the very last point. Just be flexible in your drafts. There's no need to go into them and go, I believe this, I believe that. Being open to different strategies, being humble enough to say, the strategy which I prefer might not actually be the best one. It might not actually be optimal on this platform where we don't have huge amounts of data about it. So being flexible will absolutely help you crush in 2024. If you want more fantasy content, we got Redraft, Dynasty, Best Ball, loads of it. Hit that subscribe button down below. We are close to 3,000 subscribers. We're giving away cold hard cash. All you need to do is leave a comment, hit the subscribe button, and you can be in the draw to win that money, win that 12 months membership for my DFS content, Rich's Dynasty content, so much more. We've got you covered here. After this video, go and watch this video about where I like to take the best running backs in 2024.